Okay, let's go. What's up, creators? I hope you're doing well. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're returning to the Analyze series. We're going to try to replicate Alex Pantela's style in Lightroom. Now you may remember that this profile, I've already covered it in the past, but a couple of you guys, Sebastian and Arno, told me to check it out once again because his style has changed quite a bit. So first of all, we're going to jump into Instagram, check out the main differences to the previous style, and just break down what he does in the color grading department. And then with that knowledge, we're going to go into Lightroom, edit a photo, and create a preset out of it. So let's get to it. So creators, here you have Alex's profile, Alex Pantela, if you want to go and follow him. And if you're right here watching this video, just interested in achieving his look, the best way to do it is to go ahead and buy the presets. Here's the link to his shop. Remember that the purpose of my tutorials isn't to go around stealing the styles of movies, creators. The purpose of my tutorials is just to learn how to color grade, and we're just using the profiles of these famous creators, famous photographers or movies as an example to create an exercise and learn in the process. Okay, so briefly, let's check out what his style looked when we created the first video. And this is in the overall general palette. We can see that his style is very flat. We're not gonna see any pure whites or any pure blacks in his image. The exposure is very dim and lowered. Then we have a very desaturated palette. The greens, very desaturated. The blues as well, desaturated. Everything is very flat and very, let's say very dim. And then we can check out the comparison to the new style. And obviously we can see the dramatic change in terms of contrast and in terms of warmth. So the most important thing that we can see that changed is the contrast. We're still preserving very well the highlights, as we can see in this image in the desert. We have the sun in the corner and we're not going to see any pure whites in this image. So highlights and whites, he's reducing them and bringing them down. But in the shadows, he's crushing them just a bit, in particular the blacks. So we have more of a contrasty looking image. Apart from that, we can see that most of the images, even in the portraits, we can see a bit of clarity and a bit of texture added in post-edition. All of these changes in terms of contrast, we're going to do them in basic corrections and in the tone curve. Then the other change that is very evident is that all of the images without exception now are very warm, highly saturated in terms of the warmth, and we can see that in the shadows, midtones and highlights, all of those areas in the image are painted with this yellow or orangey cast. This is done in color grading, otherwise known or previously known as split toning. Then apart from that, his overall color palette is very similar to the previous style. We still have that high desaturation on the cold tones. Blues, aquas, magentas are basically gone. So right here, this image is shot in the shadows and we should have a bit of blue creeping in into the blacks. We don't have any of that. It's completely desaturated and gone, with the exception of images which are shot at sea. Then obviously he returns a bit of the saturation. It would be logical. And then the other change is that the greens are shifted towards the warmer tones and they have a bit more saturation than in the previous style. So notice how the deep greens and the more vivid greens, all of them have a very similar amount of saturation and a very similar tone. Now, this is done in HSL in conjunction with camera calibration, which is a tool that allows us to create this homologated palette between different colors. So right here, yellows, greens, darker greens are all being meshed into a single color. Now, another thing that we have to keep in mind, because he's moving around with camera calibration, is notice how the skin tones are very orange. This is just a byproduct of messing around with camera calibration. You're also affecting the greens, but also affecting the yellows, which are in the skin tone. So therefore, all his skin tones are very orangey, and it looks like that he doesn't mind having orangey skin tones. It's not ideal for me, but it's just his style. So that's it for the analysis, guys. Now let's jump into Lightroom and start color grading. But before that, as always, I have to remind you that this preset that we're going to create today is going to be included in the Edit Like preset pack V3. Link up here in case you want to check it out. In that preset pack, you're going to find all the presets that we've created in the Edit Like series throughout this season. As I continue to analyze and break down more styles, more presets will be added into that pack. So that's a great way you can skip all my tutorials and avoid hearing my droning voice all the time. And in the process, you can support me so I can continue to do videos for you guys. If you're not interested in that pack, check out my personal presets, my personal LUTs that I use every single day to edit my photos and videos. I'll be very thankful if you can support me in that manner. If not, don't worry guys, just like the video, comment, all those things. Let's jump into Lightroom and start color grading. Okay, creators, here in Lightroom Classic, I have this little collection of images, and none of the images are shot in exactly the same lighting and environmental conditions as Alex's photos, but I think this one over here will work perfectly to try to replicate the colors. So I'm just going to select this one, and with D on my keyboard, I'm going to move into the develop module. But before that, as you can see over here in yellow, I have this photo from Alex, and I'm going to use this as a reference to create a side-by-side comparison between our edit and the image that we want to achieve the same color grade. So before we jump into the develop module, I'm just going to right click on it, and I'm going to set it as a reference photo. Then with D on my keyboard, I'm going to move to the develop module over here. Now to activate your side-by-side comparison with your reference photo, you can select Shift R on your keyboard, and then your reference photo will appear at the left so you can compare your edit. Now don't confuse it with the before and after, which is applied with Y on your keyboard. At the left is going to be your original photo, and at the right your final edit. So Shift R on your keyboard to activate the reference photo. So this is in essence what I want to achieve in this photo of myself just messing around with some analog cameras. Okay, now let's move down into the editing part. First of all, we're going to use the basic corrections, which is highlight, shadows, whites and blacks, a bit of the presence tab, and also the tone curve to achieve the contrasty look that we saw whilst preserving the highlights. And then we're going to move down into the color grading tools down here. So first of all, exposure and contrast. Now, as you can see, in exposure, I've already added a minus 0.35 stops of exposure because this image was a tiny bit overexposed, but I do not want this 0.35 stops to be applied into the other images when I apply this preset. This is just a correction, a local correction, if you wish, for this image in particular. So exposure, contrast, temperature, and tint, we're going to omit them, not save them within the preset. So we're going to use these 4 tools maybe to compensate any misfortune or any misshooting that we did on field. So let's move down to highlights. Now, highlights, remember that we want more information in the bright points on our image. We want to bring them down. If we go towards the positives, we introduce more brightness, therefore more contrast. So we're going to go towards the negatives. Not too much. We won't want an image which is completely flat. Maybe around the minus 45 is going to be enough. Then the shadows, we don't want to go towards the negatives, otherwise we introduce too much contrast. We're going to go a bit towards the positives to the plus 35s, just to introduce a bit more information in the dark points on our image, like over here. And then whites and blacks are different to shadows and highlights. Let's say that whites and blacks control the extremes of our exposure, the brightest points and also the darkest points. Meanwhile, shadows and highlights are more in the middle of our exposure. So whites, remember that we didn't have any pure whites in the images. So we're just going to move it down towards the negatives around the minus 10. And then we're going to introduce more contrast in the dark points on our image by reducing the blacks towards the negatives. Notice if I go towards the negatives, our image instantly becomes more contrasty. Maybe not too much, maybe a 20% is going to be enough. Okay, so the image is looking a bit more contrasty, but we're not quite there. Let's move down into the tone curve. Now, in the tone curve, we can basically do exactly what we did in the basic corrections, but we're not limited by 4 sliders. Down here, we can just add all the points that we want and divide our image into the amount of control points as we want. As you can see, you can add infinite number of points. I'm just going to reset all of these. And first of all, I'm just going to create a point in the midtones. We want to preserve the midtones so we don't move them around. And if you're not too sure where I placed it, you can always copy the values over here. Input, I have 119, and also as well in the output, these are basically the x-axis and the y-axis for the coordinates of this point over here. So right here, this point is preserving our midtones. I'm just going to drag the highlights down because we don't want any pure whites, and just dragging a bit more of the overexposed parts towards the negatives. Just around there. The output is going to be 235. And then if we take a look at our reference image over here, if we pay attention to the points which should be black in the image of Alex, if you compare it to the black of the interface of Lightroom, well, they're not black, they're grayish. So he's fading out the blacks or making them a bit more grayish, and that we can do it in the tone curve over here by moving this point down here, which will control the blacks. We're not going to go towards the negatives, otherwise we introduce more black. Going to push it up towards the positives, and notice how our blacks tend towards the grayish tones. Obviously, this is way too much. I'm just going to go with a value around maybe a 10% in the output, and that's just creating this overall grayish tone in the darkest points on our image. Now, the problem that I have with raising the blacks is that we're also raising a bit of the shadows, and we're losing a bit of that contrast that we added in the basic corrections. So what I'm going to do is create a point over here in the shadows, and I'm going to drag it below the diagonal, introducing more strength into the dark points on our image. Something around these values, it's going to be input in the 18, and output as well in the 18. Now our image is looking very punchy, very contrasty compared to our original image. Now, as you can see, a little byproduct of adding contrast is that we're adding more saturation. We didn't move any of the sliders that control saturation, but we just add more contrast and therefore more intensity into some of the colors. And that's why our image compared to original is a bit more colorful. But we're going to take care of that in the future. Don't worry about it. So to finalize our exposure and contrast, up in the presence tab, we have texture and clarity. And once again, if I put up our reference photo over here, we can notice that we have a little bit of sharpness, extra clarity and texture in the image, in particular in the wrinkles and also in the face. We can notice it. So I'm just going to go towards the positives, not too much with the texture, otherwise it becomes completely unnatural. This is just looking horrible, in particular the out of focus elements. I'm going to go around the 5% to a 10%, depending on what you want. And then clarity again, not towards the positives too much, otherwise we introduce too much contrast in the midtones, maybe around the 5% as well, just to add a bit more sharpness and crispiness into our image. And there we have our exposure and contrast basically done. So that's it for the exposure and contrast. Now let's move down into the color grading. Now for color grading, we're going to use three tools: camera calibration, color grading, and also HSL. It's not going to be too difficult of an edit. Now, first of all, let's move down to camera calibration, which is a tool that will allow us to change the green, the red, and the blue primaries, otherwise known as the RGB. The combination of these three colors will affect the entirety of our image, as these three colors control the exposure and also the tonality of every single pixel on our digital image. So we always have to keep in mind that you're changing the entire color palette or the entire color science of your photograph by messing around with these three sliders. So for example, as you can see, if I move the blue primary, I'm going to move, yes, the blues, but also I'm going to affect the other colors as well. So pay attention how I move it, and we're changing dramatically the rest of the image. So always have to keep in mind that this tool is supremely powerful, and you have to be very careful so you don't have unwanted changes in other colors that you're not editing. So right here, what we want to do in camera calibration, first of all, is make all the greens more similar to each other. In the background, we have some deeper greens. Over here, we have some darker ones. Over here, we have some vivid ones. We want to change them into a very similar hue so we can edit them in a similar manner. So first of all, green primary, not going to go towards the positive. Otherwise, we change all of the greens. As you can see, they all become a same color into more of a cooler tone. We want to go towards the negatives and not too much. Otherwise, our image is a bit too yellowish. Maybe around an 11-15% is just going to be enough. Again, I like to be a bit more conservative with the values that I introduce in camera calibration. And then saturation will control the amount of brightness. So if you introduce more saturation into a specific hue, it will amp up also the exposure. As you can see, if I pull up the saturation on the green primary, all the greens become a lot more vivid and a lot more bright. Now, I'm not interested in this for this edit. We want to bring it down to make them a bit more opaque. So again, towards the negatives, around an 11 to 15 is going to be enough. With this movement, we can see that the greens in the background are a bit more similar or closer to the greens that we have in the foreground and also down here. They're not too dissimilar from each other. Now, another thing that we want to do here in camera calibration is also the skin tones. As we saw in the example images, we saw that Alex's skin tones in some images was a bit oversaturated, but normally it was a bit more towards the tan colors, a bit more orangey and yellowish, not completely natural. And we can achieve this in camera calibration. So what I'm going to do is move the red primary, as obviously the red will control all of the pinks and the reds in the skin. And we're going to take it towards the positives, not towards the negatives, towards the positives. So we introduce a bit more yellow. So I'm going to go around an 11%, 12% is going to be enough. And then I'm going to combine this yellow that I introduced over here in the red primary by adding a bit of orange in the blue primary. Yes, you heard me right. I'm going to add a bit more orange with the blue primary. Why? Because, well, as you can see, this is what happens. You introduce more orange into the image because the blue is direct opposite to the yellows in the color wheel. Over here, you can see the global color wheel. We have the blues on one side, and the other color, which is going to be greatly affected by the blue primary, is going to be the oranges and the yellows. The same thing occurs with the greens. The greens, if you remove the greens, you're going to alter the magentas. And when you alter the reds, you're going to alter the aquas over here. So you always have to keep in mind the camera calibration works with complementary colors. So one color will affect all the other colors in the image, but mostly that color that you're editing, and the direct opposite in the color wheel. I know it's a lot of gibberish. I already made a tutorial about camera calibration, link up here in case you want to check it out, where I go more in detail and you can see some examples on how to use it. So right here, I'm just going to introduce a bit more orange into the skin tone towards the negatives. And as you can see, Our skin tones are completely orange over here, which is way too much. I'm going to go with a value around the -5 just to make them a bit more orangey than usual. Okay, so we can see what camera calibration has done, and it's a very minuscule movement over here. In this image in particular, we deactivated this before and after, and it's a very subtle change, just homologating a bit of the greens in the background and changing a bit of the skin tones. Now let's move up into HSL to detail some of the colors. Camera calibration works with the entirety of the colors of your image. HSL works with specific colors. So HSL is, well, it's previously known as HSL. Now it's within Color Mixer. You can find HSL over here. And here you can change the hue, the saturation, and the luminance of any specific color that you wish. So in the hue, we're just going to move two sliders. We're going to move the yellows, which will control a lot of the greens, as you can see over here. We're going to change them towards the warmer tones as well. We don't want them towards the emeralds, a bit towards the negatives, maybe around the 50s, something around these values. And then the greens will control the deeper greens, as you can see. We're going to change them towards the negatives as well, a bit more towards the negatives than the previous slider, just to make them a bit more similar to each other, just taking them closer to each other. And there we have very orangey and very yellowish greens in the background. Next, in saturation, I'm going to bring down a bit of the intensity of most of these greens and the blues. So first of all, in his images, we didn't see any blues, so I would be tempted to go towards the -100. But again, we don't want the image to be completely black and white over here, which is very strange. I'm going to go around the -75s for the aquas and also for the blues over here. And again, if your image has a lot of blue, maybe the sea or maybe the sky, I would advise you to maybe bring back a bit of a saturation so the image isn't completely unnatural. Then purples, we don't have any purples on these images. And magentas, I'm going to leave it at 0 just in case you're taking a photo of a model which is white skinned. Normally the lips in people with white color skin are controlled by the magentas, and you don't want the lips to be completely black and white. So I'm just going to leave it at 0 just in case. But we are going to bring back a bit of the saturation on these greens, which are very vibrant. Just going to take it around the -30s. It's going to be the value for the yellows and the greens, just taking out a bit of the intensity of these hues over here. Okay, so this is the before and after from our color mixer. We have a very vivid image. Now we're making it a bit more dim and desaturating the specific hues and taking the greens towards the colors that we wanted. Now, the final step is adding that warm cast into the entirety of the image that we saw in basically all the images, independently if they were shot in the jungle or in the desert. All of the images had a very warm cast added into the entirety. Now, right here, you could be tempted to use the temperature slider that we have all the way at the top. But the problem with this slider is that I find it to be a bit inconsistent. Maybe if I apply this amount of Kelvin for this image, it looks great. But for another image, another raw image that was shot in a cooler scenario, a cooler white balance, maybe it's not going to be enough and it's not going to perform exactly the same. So that's why I like to omit it and instead apply all my temperature changes in the color grading, which is a lot more consistent, in particular when I'm creating presets. So I'm going to go down into the color grading module over here. So color grading is a tool that allows us to add a tint into the shadows, into the midtones, and into the highlights. But in this case, what we're interested in doing is painting our entire image with a specific hue. And therefore we're going to go all the way to the right. We have our global color wheel. So I'm just going to add some saturation over here to find the specific color that we want. You guys can go ahead with more of an yellowish tone, maybe an orangey, maybe more of a reddish tone. But if you're not too sure what color you want to add, you can always select your reference photo. And with this little square over here, you're going to find the eyedropper. You're going to select it and drag it into your reference photo. And what you're interested in selecting over here is something that you know that is neutral in terms of color. So anything gray, white, or black shouldn't have a tint added. So I'm going to go to the blacks over here because we don't have any white or gray. And as you can see, if I point my eyedropper in the blacks, you can see that in the global color wheel it's selecting me this specific hue. Well, it's basically bouncing around in the warmer tones, indicating that there is a hue added into the shadows as well. So maybe this value could be the value that I'm going with. And in this case, I'm just going to reduce a bit of the saturation because it's way too much. Maybe a very subtle percent, around the 9% is going to be just enough. The hue is going to be 20 or 19 depending on what you're looking for. So again, just like in camera calibration, in the color grading department, I like to go a bit more subtle with the saturation values because, well, you don't know how it will perform in other scenarios. Maybe it's way too saturated. I like to make our presets a bit more useful for different scenarios. And then if you want more of an intense look, you can always go down into the settings and move them manually. So I'm going to go with 20 in the hue and the saturation around the 10%. Okay, so we look at our comparison with our reference photo, and it's looking very similar, not quite because we don't have the exact same vegetation or exact same greens that he has in the background, but it's looking very similar in terms of contrast and also in terms of the hue. I'm quite happy with these results. Okay, so the preset is now complete, so let's save it and apply it into other images just to make sure that the preset works perfectly in other photos as well. And it's not only the case that it works well in this one in particular. So let's save the preset by going into the left panel over here. On the presets, hitting the plus sign and create preset. Now over here, you want to mark all the little boxes that we did use and unmark anything that we didn't use. For example, exposure, white balance, and contrast, we don't want to mark them. And also we didn't use any effects over here. Okay, so how about in this image of myself? As you can see, this image originally is very contrasty, very punchy because of the lighting situation. Let's apply the preset. It's already in the Edit Like Preset Pack V3. And there we have our before and after. We have those orangey tan skin tones that we were looking for. We have a contrasty look, and also notice the greens in the background more towards the warmer tones and those blues a bit desaturated. I think we did quite a good job. So let's see it in this image of my dog Emmett. Let's apply it over here. And it looks fantastic in this image. The greens are very controlled, very warm. And I think we did quite a good job over here. In particular, notice differences. We have darker greens in the background, more bright greens over here, and they look very similar to each other. Finally, let's test it out in this image in California. I don't have any desert photos because he does apply the same style into desert photos, but let's see how it performs in a similar lighting scenario like this one. Let's apply the preset over here. And remember, you can always play around with the intensity slider over here. In this case, I'm going to leave it at 100%. And I think we did quite a good job. We have a very nice warm cast added into the entirety of the image. Notice how the sky and the background, the blues, are a bit dimmed down. I have those orangey, very orangey skin tones in this case, a bit too much for my liking, and a very nice contrasty look for this image. So there you have it, guys. This is how I would achieve Alex Pantela's newest style in Lightroom. I hope you achieved some knowledge out of this video, and remember that the preset that we created today is already in the Edit Like Preset Pack V3 and also the Edit Like LUT Pack V3. So I've reconverted all these Lightroom presets into LUTs so you can apply it into your video as well. So link up here to my shop, just browse around, maybe you find some of my personal presets or my personal LUTs interesting. I use them every single day to edit in a faster manner, and maybe they can help you out as well. So if you can support me in that manner, I'd be very thankful. If not, you can always subscribe to the channel as a YouTube member. If you want to go above and beyond, there's also my Patreon. And if you can't spare some bucks, don't worry, guys. Just like the video, share it with a friend, or share it in some YouTube group or on social media. That helps me out quite a bit as well. So that's it for today, guys. I'm Tony Fuentes. Cheers to all of you, and I'll see you in the next one.